Every year, the Distinguished Lecture Series at the University of Maine at Presque Isle brings a series of speakers to our campus with national and international reputations, public meetings just like this one. And tonight I want to welcome and introduce our first speaker of the school year, Karin Fisher, senior reporter for the Chronicle of Higher Education. The Chronicle is an independent national magazine and website that covers issues important to colleges and universities. It has more than 70 full-time writers, 17 foreign correspondents, and is a preeminent American source for higher education news. Karin Fisher joined the Chronicle in 2005 to write about higher education politics and policy in the United States. Ms. Fisher now covers the business of international education and the globalization of higher education, including competition for foreign students, activities of American colleges and universities overseas, and the internationalization of the college experience. She also writes about the role of colleges and universities in the economic development of their towns and states and regions. And she's traveled extensively. Earlier this year, Ms. Fisher traveled throughout Asia as a participant in the East-West Center's 2010 Jefferson Fellowship Program. A 1996 graduate of Smith College, Ms. Fisher is also the recipient of numerous awards and fellowship. These include the Paul Miller Washington Reporting Fellowship, the National Press Foundation Fellowship on the Business of Higher Education, the Whitney Independent Press Award for Political Coverage, the West Virginia Press Association Awards, the Poynter Institute News Reporting and Writing Fellowship for college graduates, and she's been honored by the Educational Writers Association. You also may have seen her on C-SPAN, and she's been a guest on National Public Radio. This is a remarkable list of accomplishments, and we are especially honored tonight because Karin Fisher grew up in Presque Isle as a resident and as a graduate of Presque Isle High School. Her other interests include running, not for public office, but athletic competition. And I may have gotten this a little off, but she's a community organizer and worker in urban tree planting. Tree planting? Good. Her topic tonight, the new China. A rising superpower opts for brain power rather than manpower and looks to U.S. colleges to help it succeed. Let's welcome to the podium Karin Fisher. Thank you.
Yes, there's only one person in my family who runs for office. He's here. You probably know my brother. So I just run races. So it's nice to be back in Presque Isle, and I'm especially happy to be here when it's not snowing, which is often the case when I come. And thanks, John, for the introduction and for using your radio voice. You probably show me up now. So as John said, I'm a reporter at the Chronicle of Higher Education, and I want to almost begin with that and offer that as a caveat. I'm a reporter, not a lecturer. I'm not an expert in anything. I'm a reporter, and somebody asked me, a student journalist asked me about this today at lunch, about why I am a reporter, and it's because I'm kind of always interested in things, and I'm a really interested observer in China. And I think a lot probably of you are, and I know actually a lot of you just in coming in today were talking to me about your own experiences in China, and so one of the things I'm really looking forward to is I hope we can have kind of a conversation and a dialogue about some of the topics that interest you. Now, I know that I'm not alone in my interest at the in China, because at the Chronicle, we always laugh. If we put China in a headline of a story, it immediately becomes the most emailed story of the day. I mean, there's just this incredible amount of interest, I think, especially in the higher education community about what's happening in China. And I think it's natural, because it's just such an incredibly exciting and dynamic and fast-moving and fast-changing place. When I was there recently, I was with a friend of mine who had lived and worked in China for several years, and she was really excited. She wanted to take me to this favorite restaurant that she had, and we were going to get soup dumplings, which are really great. And so we walked around and around and around and around and around, and so finally she had to give up, and she had to say, I haven't been here for a year and a half, and I don't recognize anything. I don't know where I am. We're lost. I mean, and that's just kind of emblematic of just the fast and the dynamic change of pace in China. I mean, the Expo, the World's Fair, was held in Shanghai. They built an entire subway line in Shanghai in 2 years. I mean, I live in Washington, D.C. They've been working on the metro for 3 decades, and it's still not done. So it's just incredible. So you know, so the subway. That's an example of what can happen in terms of muscle. You know, if manpower, if you know the government puts its mind to it, they can build a subway. But now I think there's become much more of a dialogue and a conversation about the importance of, you know, what needs to happen in terms of brain power. I mean, for a long time, you know, after the Cultural Revolution, there was kind of a hostility. There was sort of an anti-intellectualism in the country. But I think increasingly, the average people, but also the government, are saying, look, we want to be a superpower. We want to compete in the world, and that's going to happen in terms of brain power. And so that's where we need to make our investments. Now, you know, we're all the way over here. We're on the other side of the world. We're in Presque Isle. And I mean, kind of can say, why do we care? And I think we care for a couple of reasons that I hope to talk about today. But I mean, I think it's really amazing. Look at me. You know, I went to Presque Isle High School. I studied French, and no offense to my very wonderful French teachers, but I should have studied Mandarin. That would have been far more helpful to me in kind of this interconnected world that we live in. And you know, I know where I'm on a college campus, so I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, but I think it's just more important, and it's becoming even more important as we're in this kind of interconnected kind of world, to be able to understand kind of the cultural differences and to work across cultural boundaries and national boundaries and really be able to speak to each other. And so when American college campuses work, whether in China or elsewhere, that allows us, I think, to gain those skills to do that. And it's not just, I think, about the differences, it's also about the similarities as well. I was in Shanghai, I was at Fudan University, and I was sitting down with this group of students, and they were all in this US-China Institute there, and they were studying US-Chinese relations. And so we had lunch, and we were sitting around, and we were talking about politics and culture and, you know, things we liked and things we didn't like, and you know, all the different things that were interesting about our two countries. And at the end of this, one of the students looked at me, he was kind of summing up, and he said, you know, I think we're more alike than we're different. We all like sandwiches and we like basketball. Okay, that's a great takeaway. But I mean, even here in Presque Isle, I mean, I learned just the other day, I mean, you publish your admissions materials in college, or in Mandarin rather. I got to have lunch with a number of students, a number of international students, including 3 from China. And so I think there really is this interest, they're very much emblematic of the interest of studying in China. I mean, those students who I met at Fudan, every last one of them, there was a group of a dozen of us, every last one of them planned to study in the United States. I mean, some of them were going to hopefully just go for a semester or for a year, but some of them were going to earn their graduate degrees here as well. And so they, like the students here, are really emblematic of a larger kind of flood of Chinese students that have been coming into the United States. I mean, China is one of the 2 largest sending countries of students to the US, but it's been growing exponentially. There are nearly 100,000 Chinese students studying in American universities, and the numbers went up 20% in just a single year. And if you look at just undergraduate numbers, they went up 60%. In the Chinese newspapers, they call it the overseas study fever, and they're talking just about how intense the interest is in studying abroad. And it's not just the United States, but certainly the United States is a very attractive place for students to go. So why are they coming? You know, one of the biggest reasons, which I'll talk about in a minute, is one about, that's really tied to what's happening in China. It's about sort of the capacity and the quality of Chinese higher education. But it's also kind of what's going on culturally in China. You know, I mentioned a moment ago sort of the difference in the changing attitudes towards higher education. And you can really see it in the family unit. Just think about it. You know, everybody knows about the one-child policy in China. Well, so think if you have one child with one set of parents and 2 sets of grandparents, all of whom care deeply and passionately about the future of that one child. So they save their money, and they save, you know, they prioritize. This becomes the most important thing, is what's going to happen to this one child. And when I was in China, I got to have dinner with this family. They welcomed me into their home. The husband was a professor at a university in Shanghai. The wife was a banker, and they had a daughter. And one of the things they wanted to talk about over dinner was about their daughter and where should she study and what should she study and should she go overseas and what was the market like. And her name was Gaobei, Bebe. And you would think that Bebe was 17 based on the conversations that we were having. But in fact, she's 7. And the parents were very careful. They were very insistent on telling me, they're like, we are not like invested in this. We are not like the crazy parents who are all into micromanaging our one child. And they're like we're pretty hands off, just so you understand. And I was like, okay, thanks. And so one of the things that's really been interesting to me too, to look at this growth in Chinese students is how kind of universal it is in American higher education. I mean, if you know anything about students coming to study in the United States from abroad, I mean, typically it's been graduate students. It's been really the top tier, these top flight students coming from China, from India especially, studying engineering, studying science, now studying business. But that, when you look at these numbers, this 100,000 students who are coming into the United States from China, they're coming to the on the undergraduate level too. They're coming to liberal arts colleges. They're coming to small colleges. For example, I talked with this girl. Her name's Jia Lu, and she's going to Mount Holyoke College, and she's just, I think, finished her sophomore year. And we were talking about, how did you find Mount Holyoke, and why did you want to go there? And she said, look, if I wanted to go to a big state university, a flagship, I could have, but then it would just be like going to school back in China. It would be impersonal. It would be thousands of other students. She said, I wanted that kind of small, intimate environment. I wanted that attention. And I remember she told me this story. She was amazed. It was the second or third week of classes, and she got an email from the dean of the college. And the dean of the college wanted to know how she was doing because she was taking a really heavy course load. And she just couldn't believe that the dean of the college knew that she was taking heavy courses and that she might be struggling. And she was just so impressed by that kind of attention. And I imagine that some of that probably rings true to some of here at UMPI, because we're talking in some ways about a small, intimate environment, a small, close environment where people know one another. Now that can create some challenges. I mean, I think one of the things that people are really wrestling with is, especially as you have an influx of students, particularly coming from one country, colleges are saying, how do we serve them well? How do we make sure that they're integrating with the rest of our students and they're getting a good experience too? Not an entirely bad problem to have, but it's been really interesting to see how universities across the country have been kind of trying to wrestle with this problem. Some of them have created these whole special kind of pathways into college where they combine really intensive English language instruction with basically your freshman year gen ed classes. And they have these for these students so that they can kind of help them get used to being in an American classroom. And some colleges that I've been to have said, look, we want to make sure that these students feel really welcome and feel like they have a network of American friends, and so they're partnering them with a Chinese student or an international student and an American student, and saying we don't want them the foreign students to self-segregate. We want them to all kind of be part of this broader network of the college. And I mean, I think for colleges, one of the reasons this is really important is, to go back to the point about becoming more global. If you can take advantage of those students, it can be a really important part of internationalizing your campus and making it much more of a global place. I mean, the traditional way that American colleges talk about this is really in doing study abroad. But if you look at the numbers of students who study abroad, they're just not that high. And so if you want to give even your American students a really interesting and really kind of global experience, you need to make sure that you're having them connect with and take advantage of those foreign students. The other reason, of course, and colleges don't really talk about this so much, but why are foreign students really important today? And why do I keep hearing about foreign student numbers and keep hearing about recruitment trips overseas? It's the economy, and colleges' budgets are not doing well. And these students who come in on the undergraduate level, they pay their own way mostly, and so they can also be an important economic part of the college. So, you know, I touched on this earlier, but back to sort of why do the Chinese students come? One of the things is it's because you have to look at what's happening in China itself. 1990, just 3% of college-age students 18 to 24 in China went to college. Today, 23% do. And if you actually looked at what those raw numbers actually are, I mean, it'd be amazing. It's just the strain on the capacity of colleges is really incredible. And the Chinese government has reacted, and one of the things that they've been trying to do is just build more colleges and have more seats for students. But that's not all. I mean, they've also been trying to really improve the colleges that they have and to compete on an international level and to invest particularly in science and technology. And one of the interesting strategies that they've had to do that is to sort of try to say, okay, we sent all these really bright people overseas years ago. They got their graduate degrees. Now we want them back. And so over the last decade, they've recruited back about 800 of them. And there are people like this guy named Andrew Yao. He's a computer scientist, really brilliant. I mean, he's so smart that he's got like a computer science principal named after him. And he was at Stanford. So a very good school and a very good school for computer science. 2004, he gets a call from Tsinghua University. And they say, look, will you come back and start this whole like advanced computer science institute for us? And they say, we'll let you hire whoever you want. We'll let you do whatever research you want. We'll let you set your curriculum. We'll give you these bright new shiny facilities. They'll be world class, they'll be high tech, they'll be great. So he says yes. And so, you know, there's really this effort to try to bring back these really top-notch people. But of course, it's not just that. It's also, as I said, about expanding capacity. It's also about improving vocational education. So the students who are not necessarily going to go to university are still getting some kind of degree or training. And it's really hard to measure what's not happening, but some people think that maybe even the outgoing numbers from China would be even higher if you weren't seeing this. I mean, UNESCO did a study and looked at students in East Asia who would be mobile, and they found that 42% of them actually are staying home. And so there's some thought that if the Chinese government wasn't being as aggressive as they are, that those numbers would be even higher. And there's also, you know, this attempt, and we were talking about kind of attracting the talent on the faculty level, but there's also, I think, they're making some efforts to attract talented people to become importers of students, to get the best students from all over the world to also come to Chinese universities. And they're kind of looking outward, and they're trying to use higher education in a way as kind of soft diplomacy. So they're going to places like Africa, and they are, you know, working there to help build up the capacity of African institutions. And all over the world, I mean, there are hundreds of them. There are many of them in the United States. They've established these Confucius Institutes, which, you know, have Chinese culture and Chinese language. So back to that question of why do we care in Presque Isle? I mean, you know, there are some people who kind of see it in very stark terms and who say, there's this global talent race on, and the country that gets the best talent, they're going to come out ahead. And, you know, some people find that kind of zero-sum talk to be a little overblown, overhyped. But even a lot of those people would say, look, one thing that's kind of worrisome is in China, and not just in China, in Singapore, in Malaysia, in Australia, in Portugal, where I just came from, these are all countries that have a strategy, that have said, here's what we want to do to somehow win in that talent race, or at least compete. And they say one of the things we worry about is that the United States, because of its history of decentralization, because of its, you know, very sort of spread out and sprawling higher education system, doesn't have that kind of national strategy. Now, there are some people who would say that's a really good thing because it frees universities to be more entrepreneurial and to come up with all kinds of great strategies to really compete and to lure the top students. Lamar Alexander, who's a senator from Tennessee, who was the Secretary of Education and was the president of the University of Tennessee, told me the story about going to China and meeting with the president. And they were both had this little confab about how concerned they were about how their two countries were doing in terms of science and technology and producing, the best research and the best, people, turning out the best people. And so Alexander says they have this talk, and he comes back, and he's like, well, in China, they just decreed it. And so there was suddenly this plan to invest in science and technology. He said, by contrast, so I came back, and I thought, this is really a problem. So I get Congress to pass some legislation to establish a committee to study the problem. Then we appoint, professors and university presidents and business leaders and political leaders. They meet for a year, and they talk about this stuff, and they write a report. Then they bring it back to Congress. We debate it. I think that it's a problem, so I sit down with, my counterpart in the House. I write a bill. The bill gets introduced. It's maybe a hearing, it gets discussed some more. Finally, it makes it to the floor of both houses. It doesn't pass the first time, it gets reintroduced. Finally, it passes, but then there's no money for it, so how do you do it? So then the next year, finally, we get some money, and it's not what we hoped for, but we get some money into the budget bill. And so now we have a strategy for science and technology and funding research in this country. Now, Alexander would say, well, look, that was messier, and yep, it took a while, but we got there in the end. There are some people who would say, God, just have the strategy, okay? So, I also was, mentioned this focus on some of the elite institutions in China, and I think some of the concerns that people there have is really what's happening with those other institutions. And there's a real concern, I think, in China about, is there this widening gulf between sort of a select group of universities and everybody else? And do these other institutions have shoddier facilities? Do they have really high student faculty ratios? Are they still stuck teaching kind of rote courses? Are they still stuck with kind of political indoctrination and Maoist thought and Dao Changping's theory? And when they worry about the one thing that people point to is they say, look, what happened last year, the education minister in China got sacked because there was these broader concerns about corruption. Now, he was never implicated, but people say, well, look, there's something that's not going quite right. And Andrew Yao, who I mentioned earlier, so he gets to Xinhua, and he starts his research institute, and he's trying to recruit, and he's having a really hard time because he can't get the caliber of students that he wants. And so he actually had to go out and go back another step and say, okay, if I want to get the students into my research institute, I'm going to have to get them when they're undergraduates. So I'm going to have to find these top undergraduates and kind of cull them and educate them so that then I can use them as my recruiting tool for my graduate institute. And so that's a real challenge. And actually today when I was talking with your students here who are from China, we were talking about, so why did you come? They told me two things. They said, the education that I'm getting here is better. And when I graduate, what the education I get here will help me get a job. And that job part's also, I think, a real motivating factor and a really interesting dynamic that's happening. McKinsey did a study a couple of years ago, and they looked at engineers who were trained in China, and they found that only about 10% of them were of the caliber who would be hired by multinational companies. And I mean, from my experience, I've talked to business groups in China, and one of the things, when I was talking to them about kind of this notion, they said, yeah, we kind of like to hire some people from overseas because, they're good problem solvers, they work well in teams, they think quickly on their feet, and sometimes we worry that the system that we have, the education system we have, doesn't give you those qualities, and so we kind of like that about the American system. And in fact, when I was talking to this group of, they were exporters, I think, and they said, yeah, in fact, we're gonna send our kids overseas to study too. And it was really funny because one of the guys there, his son worked with him, and the father did not speak English, but the son spoke perfect English. And so afterwards, he said to me, he was like, yeah, he said, we want to go overseas to study too. And he was like, winking, and I was like, oh, okay, get out of your, get away from your dad, apparently. So it's kind of a mixed bag, but I say this, not to scare people about China, not to scare American colleges about China. And frankly, I don't think anybody is scared. I mean, I don't think a day goes by where I don't get another press release about, or an email about a college in the United States, going to China to form an institutional partnership, doing a student exchange, having really innovative academic research that they're doing jointly. And so I think that there's a lot that's really happening there, and I think that when I talk with American universities and when I talk with their Chinese counterparts, they really see the kind of the mutual benefit of it. And that would just be, the mutual part I think is really important. I mean, I've talked, and I'm kind of guilty of this, a lot about bringing Chinese students to the United States. But I think one thing that people are starting to pay a lot more attention to is we have to send Americans to China and overseas in general. Right now, so 100,000 Chinese students come here, 13,000 American students go to China. And President Obama last year said that we should set this goal of sending 100,000 students over the next 4 years to study in China. Of course, one of the really challenging things for that is education, or is language education rather. You know, you just don't have the skill level. And so even though you know, the numbers of students going to study in Asia is really increasing, it's still just a fraction of those students who go abroad. And so I think there's going to have to be this investment and this sort of gradual move of students who are going to say, okay, I'm going to study Chinese. And you do see it. I mean, I went to the University of Buffalo earlier this year, and I was talking to them, what are your students studying in languages? They said the 3 most popular languages, Chinese, Japanese, Korean. So I know my talks build about being about China, but I just wanted to, before I wrap up here, take a couple minutes to talk about 2 other places I think, if China interests you, might be also worth thinking about and looking at. One is India, and I mentioned earlier that India and China are the 2 largest senders of students to the United States, and in fact, India is the largest sender of students, although at the rate China's going, it won't be for long. And so it's amazing. You go to India and you go to a neighborhood and you see all these advertisements for SATs and GREs and college recruitment agencies, you know, who will place Indian students in American colleges or British colleges or Australian colleges. And it's like here where you'd see advertisements for Trident Gum and McDonald's. It's really crazy. I mean, I was staying in this neighborhood. It was called the Gulmer Park Journalist Welfare Association, which all of my friends said maybe was a good idea, given the trajectory of my particular profession, that I should maybe look into that. But it was amazing. I would walk down the street and every single light pole was just Christmas treed with these advertisements for studying overseas. And it just sort of spoke to the appetite of it. But possibly the most striking thing to me about India was just the have and have-nots, the real distinct cultural divide there. And you know, you can go to a place like this sort of satellite city that's right outside of Delhi. It's called Gurgaon, and it's the home to all of the multinationals in India. It's this really high-tech, just all glass and steel, and you walk around and you know, it's IBM and Microsoft and Boeing, and you know, everybody's beautifully dressed and speaks beautifully and has, you know, a degree from the best universities in the world. And then you can go just a couple miles down the road and you look out your window and there are these people in these like little shanties kind of haphazardly against the side of the road, and they're running into the road and you're like, what are they doing? And you realize then they're collecting the cow dung from the road to sell as fuel. And it's kind of that kind of disparity is evident in the higher education system there too. Because on one hand, you have these IITs, these business and engineering schools that are just can compete with the best in the world, and they're really great. And you know, there's the competition to get into them is fierce, because if you get in, you've got a golden ticket. Your future is just bright. Then I went to another college, which name I will not mention, where you walked into the faculty lounge and they had a sign up that said, faculty class on email use. And so the faculty didn't know how to use email at this college. And you think, if you want to have international partnerships, using email kind of helps, right? So the other place I just wanted to mention is kind of an interesting place to look, and one that's really been intriguing to me is Indonesia. And you know, Barack Obama kind of put Indonesia on the map, which was probably good, because before that, most Americans could probably not find it. But it's really kind of an amazing place, and it's kind of unfortunate that it's true that we know nothing about it, because it's this incredibly large country, 240 million people. It's the largest Muslim majority country in the world. It's the largest Muslim democracy in the world. And it's a really interesting place because there's so many challenges, and yet there's so much hope, and there's this real recognition in that country that we really need to invest in education, and we really need to improve our educational system, or we have a real problem. And in fact, the Indonesian and the US governments have made education the central part of their bilateral relationship, and which is something that the Indonesians really need, because I was talking with the educational attaché from Indonesia, and he said, look, we're spending 20% of our budget on education. He said, if we took that money and we just spent it on teacher salaries and teacher training, there would be no money for anything else. We couldn't give scholarships, we couldn't build schools, we couldn't repair schools, we'd just be paying for teachers. That's how kind of far behind they are. And so there was a lot of excitement there that just a couple months ago, President of Indonesia and the President of the United States announced this partnership. The US is going to spend $165 million in the next couple of years to improve education in Indonesia and to improve partnerships with Indonesian and American universities. And there's a whole sort of process now for people to apply who have interesting ideas for working with Indonesia. And the ambassador in Indonesia said kind of an interesting thing to me. He said, look, I can't change the rainfall. He said, I can't do anything for the Indonesians. And this is a big problem because it's an archipelago. So if climate change happens, half the country will be underwater. He said, I can't do anything about that. He said, what I can do something about is education. And he said, look, if we can change education, if we can make that a possibility, then we can change the people and their opportunity. We can change a whole generation. So I'm going to wrap up there, but I just thought that was kind of an interesting point, and one that really kind of undergirds, I think, what's happening also in China and also in India. And so, as I said before, I hope we can kind of have a conversation and have some discussion, and I'd love to hear about your thoughts and your experiences. So thanks.
We'll reserve some time for questions. Everybody has questions for Karin Fisher.
Somebody's got to start. Is it your sense that many of the students are expecting to live a professional life that will be back and forth between China and the United States for the next 50 years?
That's an interesting question, actually, because I think somewhat. And it's really interesting to compare China to India, where, so I told you that the Chinese numbers have gone way up. The Indian numbers have been dropping for the past couple of years. And one of the reasons that people think fewer Indian students are coming to study in the United States is Indian students want to stay. And so if they don't feel like they're going to get to stay in the US after they earn that degree, they don't necessarily want to come. Whereas the Chinese students that I've met, and sort of what I hear, we have a correspondent in China who I work a lot with as well. And I think what I hear from them is more, we see ourselves either having a more multinational experience in China, or doing something where we're going back and forth and really working kind of in this broader world.
What's your take on the differences between our general education based in liberal arts and the Chinese basic education focused on other sorts of things? Where do you see that going, and how does that play into the desire of students to come here and their government to send students here?
Well, typically the notion was you started and you committed, and you said from day one in China, I'm going to study engineering, and you were going to study engineering. And so there wasn't this notion that you had to have this sort of broader kind of general education to underpin your experience. Now that's changing somewhat. I mean, there are a number of colleges in China that have started to try to create general ed requirements, have tried to interject kind of more liberal arts sort of alternative courses that students can take, have tried to incorporate the notion of a residential college for first-year students, the way that a number of American universities do to kind of bring first-year students in and give them kind of both academic and kind of social support. There are a couple of liberal arts colleges that have sprung up. I know our correspondent in China wrote about one that was started by a university actually in Hong Kong that wanted to make its mark, and so they started a liberal arts college in China. And at first, they put it as an option on the exam, on the national exam, and nobody came. But after a while, they got a few takers, and students actually came at first because they liked the idea that they were going to go to a college that was associated with a college in Hong Kong. But after a while, they started to come back, and it's been about 5 or 6 years now, and they're kind of getting students now who really want to study liberal arts. Their problem is that everybody thought they were going to fail, so nobody paid any attention to them, and everybody just let them do whatever they wanted. And now that students actually want to come there, people in the government are taking a little bit more of a look at how that liberal arts education is being crafted.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah.
And I'll take you back there, and I'll take Joan over.
One of the things, when you mentioned that there were 13,000 students from the U.S. studying in China now, and 100,000 Chinese students here, and that looks like almost an order of magnitude disparity. And with the raw numbers it is, but if you look at that as a proportion of the population of the two nations, I just, running the numbers in my head, it may only, depending on what I can dredge up between my ears for what the population of the U.S. is now, I think something like 310 million or something like that. It may only be, within an order of magnitude, it may only be a threefold proportionate. I figured something for China, I figured something like 9,000% of the general population, and for the U.S. something somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000%. So it may only be a factor of maybe 2 to 3 proportionately. So it's not as
Dire.
damning as it looks. And I think you hit the nail on the head. I think a lot of Americans, when they think about studying abroad, don't necessarily think of China probably because of the language issue. I suspect that is, and it's not known what opportunities are there either. I think it may be because it's not that well known.
Yeah, no, I think you make a good point. I think it's a couple of things. And I should say, well, I do think part of the thing that worries some people is that it's, for all of Asia, only 10% of students who study abroad study in Asia. And you think about how important Asia is becoming, and still most Americans who study abroad, go to traditional places. They go to France, they go to Spain, they go to the UK. And so I think that's part of what concerns people. But I think more to your point about, I think the language is a big part. I think the other thing that really is changing actually, but it's going to be gradual, is that you think about what encourages students to study abroad, and one of the most important factors for students to study abroad, faculty. And so if you have faculty who know the university and are comfortable with it and are willing to accept the credits that a student gets from studying abroad, then it's much more likely that they're going to go to that place. And so I think as more and more faculty develop academic ties with institutions in China, those numbers may change. And I should also say that it's 10%, but the number of students going to study in Asia has grown 200% in the last 5 years. So there's a trend.
I have a question. I guess you can go next, sir. Did you have a question?
Yeah.
I'll go 1, 2, and then you in the back, sir? You were just waiting? Okay.
I suppose I have sort of a question, and I'm not sure if I'm putting on the spot if you're not familiar with this data or what, but
on the secondary level. I have to admit I know less about the secondary level than I do about higher education. But I do think, I mean, there is kind of a trend generally. I mean, when I was in Indonesia, I met with a business leader there who essentially was funding, several hundred students in Indonesia every year to go study in the United States because he thought it was important enough. But I think in Indonesia, certainly, it's very ad hoc.
So, other than academics, what do you think are some of the primary reasons why Chinese students choose to come to the States versus another country in the world, and like same for American students going to China?
Well, and that's, I mean, I didn't really talk about that, but I mean, it's a competitive world out there, and a lot of students, Australia, for example, is super aggressive about trying to recruit students, probably in India more than China, but, the Australian higher education system would not be sustained today if they were not drawing foreign students to come. So, I think when I talk to Chinese students, they talk a lot about the academics, but I think it's also about culture. And I laugh at the guy with the sandwiches and the basketball, but I mean, there was sort of this feeling that the two countries have a lot in common, that they are similarly entrepreneurial and kind of have a bit of a same cultural feel to them, and sort of this little bit of a hunger. And so I think that's partly what attracts students to study, Chinese students to study here. The American students who I talk to who study in China, they used to be cultural. They used to, be Asian studies majors, and that's why they went, or they were, studying Mandarin. Increasingly, and if you look at the numbers, it's people who, like a lot of business students are going to study in China. And so it's a lot of students who are thinking kind of a couple of steps ahead and are thinking about their careers and just saying, wait, what's going to be beneficial to me? And I gotta go to China.
I think I can add to something to this question. I'm from China. I would say why Chinese students, their first choice, if they have the opportunity, to go to other countries to study, is U.S. That's because the United States has the best universities. Okay, yes, we do have the best universities. U.S., the McDonald's, KFCs in China, they are brought from U.S. Okay. That's probably.
And a lot of them.
Yes, back to just 2-3 years ago, there were not many students coming to U.S. because back to Bush's time, the door was closed a little bit. There was a reason for this, terrorism or whatever. But we know terrorists are not from China. Later, they realized that they're not from China, from somewhere else. So the door is open wide. Of course, there's another factor, economy,
Although, you know, I do hear from universities who say, particularly universities that have really strong historic ties with China, so like a Yale, will say to me, we are seeing many, many more people, many more students come in as freshmen who speak Chinese and have been taking it for years. So, but it's a slow process.
If I could add too, that children, although people do study English in schools, very few of those students can actually speak it. Yeah, they studied it. You know, how many people do we have to say hello, hello? Just the same way we would say ni hao, hello. And that was about the only thing they remember from those studies. So
Yeah, that's
it's
back to
true.
when I was in
Yeah.
China, I couldn't read, I couldn't write, but I didn't speak well, you know. The first time I came to the US, that time I was a visiting professor at the University of Colorado. Less than 4 weeks, I was going to the field with a professor to Mexico. The professor was so surprised because he said, "You know a lot about English." Yes, but I said I don't speak well. So I can read, I know lots of, you know, terminology or vocabulary, but, you know, yes, that's the problem. So that's why China, they recruit teachers from the US, from Canada, from Australia, or, well, even from Africa. The people from Africa who go to China to teach English.
And Andrea's next, and then Mike, and if anybody else put their hand up when they're done with their questions.
Do you think there's a positive impact politically between this relationship, the educational relationship between our two countries?
Well, they certainly hope so. I mean, there's definitely this notion of using education as kind of a sort of a softer form of diplomacy to come in, and you know, I'm not sure about China because, frankly, there was I think there's been more of a tense relationship of late, you know, between China and the U.S. And there was some thought when Obama threw out this 100,000 students going to China, it was kind of like the one positive note in his speech. But definitely, you know, if you take Indonesia, I mean, they really see building up the educational relationship and building that tie as being completely central to kind of overcoming some sort of hostilities that existed between the two countries. I mean, we're talking about visa issues. I mean, you know, the ambassador said to me, you know, 85% of students from Indonesia get their student visas. He said, but you know, I got to try to convince the parents that it's going to be safe for their students to even apply to the visa and go study in the United States because their kid's named Mohammed. And you know, you have to kind of overcome those sort of perceptions on both sides. And so, you know, one of the things that people would say to me about, again, about Indonesia is they would say, okay, there's been this sort of tension, but if you look, almost every single person who's in the government today studied in the United States, came here, you know, on a short-term study program, their kids studied here, and so if you can if you know each other and you build on it, then that can improve relations.
And I think Chun Wong, he's on our faculty here. He teaches geology, and there's some other things you do too, GIS. Well, what surprised me was what he said. He said that people in China start studying English, certainly by the middle school, and a lot of times here, and it's not just the Chinese or Asian languages that get short shrift in this country. When I was in college, well, I took German in college. They eliminated German at my alma mater. So and I mean, particularly at the secondary level, when budgets get tight in local school districts, what's one of the first things to go? Art, music, foreign languages. And you see that a lot. And so it's not just Asian languages that are short-sightedly being ignored, but other things too. And I think that's a problem. If we're going to send, if that is a barrier to Americans studying in Asia, that's something we are going to have to address if we're serious about connecting with the global economy.
It's hard hard though. I mean, the part of the problem is that now English is the lingua franca, and so you
Yeah.
have to make it's harder to make the argument. You've got to learn something else because it's not always, what else do you learn? What makes the most sense? So.
Well, my dad was in the Army of Occupation in Germany about 3 or 4 years after World War II. He said in Germany everybody knew English, and he said to me years ago, he said the days when, you know, the Americans would go their dollar bills and their Lucky Strikes and nylons or whatever, and you know, assume that everybody knew English all over the world. And he said those days are over. And he said that 30 or so years ago. But it does seem to be that English does seem, even in science, it amazes me how many articles you can get in English from foreign journals.
No, that's true. And in fact, there are lots of programs that are seeking to be international in science, for example, that
Yeah.
are in places like Germany that are in English. So.
Any other questions?
You had mentioned that with Chinese students, the whole multinational is an idea. And as Americans, we're the #1 growing economy for Chinese goods. So along the rationalization that if they're going to study, what better place to study or consumer than to come here, right? And education is better. The other side of the coin as American students is if the accreditation agreements are not there, there holds no appeal for us to even bother looking at it. So that's the #1 downside it seems to actually establishing and getting students over to China.
Yeah, you make a good point about that. I mean, one of the big complaints that that people have about American universities is they kind of go, they take a little trip, they shake a few hands, they sign a piece of, the president or the provost or whoever's on the trip signs a piece of paper and gets shoved in a box, and that's it. And so I think one thing I hear from a lot of universities is, okay, we have a whole filing cabinet of these agreements, but we want to make them more effective, as you say. We want to actually have our students go overseas. I mean, you know, I can't tell you how many times I'll hear from a college, well, yeah, we're taking 10 of their students this year, but we're not getting any of our students to go. And so I think that one thing I do hear a lot from colleges is, how can we make these relationships really be substantive so that we really are, you know, we're really engaging our faculty in research that they want to do with partners that they want to have, you know, that we're really sending our students to places that they want to go for courses that they're going to be able to count towards their majors, and that are really helping, on both sides, helping both institutions really make change.
If our students go to a Chinese university, how well integrated are they? Are they integrated into the local society or the campus community? Is the campus community comparable to ours?
You know, it's really very variable. There are some places that just have these direct exchange, some colleges that just have these direct exchange agreements where their students really are staying with a host family or they're staying in a dorm, and the conditions aren't necessarily quite the same, and they're having to adjust to that. And so there are a number of colleges, especially ones that have larger programs that send a lot more students to China, and they often have these kind of programs in which their program's kind of embedded in the university there, and so sometimes the faculty is actually coming from the US, sometimes the students are only taking some of their classes with their Chinese counterparts. Often it's about language, it's not just about accommodations. And so there's a lot of, people are trying to figure out what's effective and if that's the kind of thing that they want to do.
Along those lines, do you have any thoughts or experience with faculty exchange and how that plays into raising those kids and making those relationships better?
Frankly, I think almost every time that I see partnerships, and I spend a lot of time looking at kind of these, because I write about sort of broader internationalization of colleges, almost every time there was a faculty member. That's almost always how it starts. There was a faculty member who had a colleague overseas, maybe they came from the partner institution, And almost always, I mean, it's, I would say faculty involvement is probably the most important thing to making these kind of relationships work. Leadership is the second most important. If you don't have people at the top level saying it's really, really important for us to become an international institution, then it's really hard to do because they control budgets and things like that. But really having faculty be committed, doing research, encouraging their students to go abroad, those things are all incredibly important.
Any other questions today?
The number of Chinese students that are coming here, they must have, to the various schools and so forth, must experience the American lifestyle and, quite liberal and quite open. And, is there any mechanism of the Chinese government or hierarchy that keeps an eye on them when they come back so that they don't come back and spread this joy about the liberal society that they just studied in and what everybody's missing over here? Is there anything that nature going on? It seems to me that I've been to China a number of times over the last several years, and it seems to me that they're not exactly happy for someone to come and try to rock the boat of the government control of most of the agencies and so forth. And it seems to me the students that would come over here would somehow have to be affected by the attitudes of this country towards about everything that occurs in society. There'd be some concern about from the Chinese government about them bringing back the sort of germ of this liberalism or whatever you want to call it. Any comments on that?
I don't actually know I don't know if there are any official programs on the reintegration end of things. I do think you're right. There's kind of a tension in China about, in some ways, this hunger for kind of Westernism and sort of pulling back. But on the other hand, the Chinese government is giving some scholarships to send students overseas, and so they're putting some value on having students go abroad and having them come back and reintegrate into society.
I get a sense that there's a new China emerging. It's a very self-confident. It's not a China that's necessarily looking out for role models. It's a China that's becoming a role model for others. And I think there's a certain attitude there that the jobs for, I think, these students are back in China. And it's probably a little different. As you say, it's changing so rapidly, but I think the perception of those students who come to the U.S. is changing with that. There's, China is a powerhouse, and it's a place to be proud to be from, and you have no really reason to feel bad about being from China when you're, the comparisons are not as stark as they were.
Well,
Certainly different
for instance, I remember being just really awestruck when was in the Forbidden Palace in Beijing, for example, and you walk in there and there was a Starbucks in the Forbidden Palace. I was flabbergasted that would be allowed. And in Shanghai they must have like 300 KFCs and so forth. So you're struck with that kind of notion that how far will this be allowed to go before it does something to
I think we've got more Chinese restaurants than they have.
I don't know. It may be
Along those same lines, I'm sorry.
That's all right. Go ahead.
My experience was that as we had that conversation about how critical it would be that their government was so for both sides spoke with they're allowed to be critical, they're allowed to question, but be reasonable about it. And something you said earlier about, there's so many similarities between us and them. That was one of them. I thought, we can be critical, just be reasonable about it. If you start, driving vans into buildings, then that's not allowed. But if you're reasonable about it, I was struck by that because I had, much like Andy, I had this sense of control and you're not going to get to criticize. And here we were in Tiananmen Square and sort of being critical of someone else.
Yeah, I was talking to a journalism professor who was, oh gosh, I would guess he was probably in his mid-40s. And he was telling me when he was in college, there was a car crash that would happen right across the street from his university. And he was on the student newspaper, and they were all too scared to write about the car crash because they were afraid for some reason that they would get in trouble if they wrote about the car crash. And now he actually, he runs kind of a center looking at how China is perceived in the media. And he kind of characterized it a bit as a balancing act, that there's, people are kind of feeling how far they can go and what's appropriate and what they can criticize and what they can't.
I agree with Dave. Actually, Dave and me, we just had a month-long trip, research trip to China in June, in July. Well, by the way, September 30th, we're going to give a talk on our Chinese trip. Our faculty long studying. You guys have time, please come. September 30th. And one thing we have to know, I have to know. I go to China once every other year. I have to know. China changes so rapidly. Even me, every time I go to China, I can hardly believe what I see there. And when I had my trip to China back to the year 2006, 2008, I was invited to give talks to the universities here. I had 300-400 people sitting there, more than this, giving talks about U.S. colleges, universities. I still have the talk.
Do you want to come up?
So the president, of course, we had a meal before the talk, and the president said, you can talk whatever you want to talk. Don't worry. Because, I came from China back 2 years ago. At that time, of course, I knew I could not talk in the things I wanted to talk about. But now the president tells me, you can talk anything you want to talk about. Don't worry. So that's the big challenge, political challenge. That's the big challenge.
One thing, a little tidbit was that 90% of all the large construction cranes in the world are in China. There are more high-rise buildings in a small city there than there are in the state of Maine. It's unbelievable.
Of course, define small city there.
Yeah.
Okay, allow for a couple more questions, then we'll go over to the reception and continue the conversation there. I have one from this young lady. You haven't spoken yet, so I'm going to let you go first, and then I'll go back to Andreas. Thank you.
I was wondering if outside our understanding of colleges, examine what role it has on students' decisions studying abroad.
It does have a bit of a role because students have a really hard time taking both the Chinese entrance exam and taking English proficiency exams, studying for both of them at the same time. And so one thing that's happened in American colleges is a lot more colleges saying, your academics are good enough, and so we're going to admit you provisionally. And so you come here, or you spend your time in China, you take your English proficiency exam, and then we'll admit you. But we'll already give you that pledge that as long as you do this, we'll let you come. And so on the American end anyway, it's starting to change the nature of sort of some of the admissions process.
And Andrew.
That's a good question. I think it's a smattering of both. I mean, one thing, the education minister who got sacked, for example, he was educated abroad, I think in New York, and his predecessor, one was not, and two was a philosopher, and people thought that was, in China, there was a lot of controversy over this new guy who hadn't been overseas that much and wasn't really tied in politically and was a philosopher, and what does that mean for education and how would they prioritize things there?
function is to the right through the hall, and you'll see the alumni room on the right. And thank you very much.